enhancing Cuban-CARICOM relationship in the near future. And my concluding remark, first, CARICOM nations are very vulnerable and fragile in economic, social, institutional, and environmental terms. Second, Caribbean countries should rely much more on their domestic and regional resources than ever before to overcome their development challenges. Third, there is a growing consensus about the necessity in CARICOM to think beyond CARICOM. Deeper economic and cooperation relations with Cuba should be part, from my point of view, of this new vision of CARICOM regionalism. Fifth, there is a potential for the expansion of trade, investment, and cooperation relations between Cuba and CARICOM. And finally, the updating of the Cuban economic model, the development of the Mariel Special Development Zone, and the dynamic effect, not the static effect, the dynamic effect of a hypothetical scenario for Cuba-US relations normalization could have a positive impact to the entire greater Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for doing so. Yeah. I must say, I'd like to thank Mr. Gomez very, very much for coping with about 1/3 of the time he'd obviously prepared for, and a change of language in mid-flow. Thank you very much indeed for dealing with that very, very difficult conditions. The last speakers, really just a couple of minutes, because we do want to have some time left for discussion. Can I start with Matthew Bishop from the Institute of International Relations? If your mic's working, stay where you are. If not, come up here. It's working? Fine. No.
It's not working, the translation.
Thanks, Matthew.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I've just got a couple of points to make. If we're talking about convergence and why we need it, I think before we do that, we need to reflect on questions of divergence, because there's a spectre hanging over this region at the moment, and it is one of pronounced divergence. I think economically, we see stratification between and within societies. Gender studies scholars use the concept of intersections to talk about the distributional consequences of inequality between classes, groups within society by gender, race, ethnicity. And I think these are very real problems that we see in the region. We see divergence in growth rates and growth models. Some of our countries are very, very technologically advanced, others much less so. We see huge amounts of poverty, as Sir Hilary Beckles talked about this morning. And it's fundamentally the poorest in our societies who are going to bear the brunt of the many other challenges that we face, like climate change, the fallout from the collapse of industries, and so on. We also see geopolitical divergence, I think, between those countries which are increasingly much closer to Latin America or the North, and others much less so. So this is a huge worry, and I think it's right that we have this event to discuss these issues. So what does convergence look like? I'm going to suggest three things that I think are important that we need to consider. The first one is that everybody in our societies need to have a stake in integration, and I don't think that is the case at present. For example, we wonder why the mass of people, are reticent about deeper integration, and I think it's because many of them don't see an obvious benefit in it. What's the point of integration for the man on the street if that person is not permitted to travel freely between the different countries and the territories? Even if he can do, what does it matter to him if he can't actually move anyway, because the transport links are so poor and underdeveloped? Secondly, in order to overcome this, we need to overcome a whole range of vested interests, of which there are many. And I think many of us could think very clearly of the kinds of vested interests which benefit greatly from some of the dysfunctions that we have within the regional movement that need to be faced down and overcome if we're going to see a different kind of integration. And then my final comment is a simple one, and it echoes something that everybody else on the panel so far has really talked about, is that if we're going to see meaningful integration in this region going forward, we can't be attached to models of integration that served us in the 1970s and 1980s. The world has moved on dramatically. So any kind of future integration and convergence has to be based on a widening of the region to include Cuba, the Dominican Republic, any nation that, or even non-sovereign territory that touches the Caribbean Sea. More broadly, it needs to be deepened. We need a much more incisive range of institutions to deal with the threats that we face. It's crazy that small individual countries are negotiating their debt situation, for example, with the IMF. You know, how can a country as small as Grenada possibly renegotiate successfully its debt terms, or certainly better than a region of 17 million people could negotiate on its behalf and on behalf of all of the countries of the region? And finally, it needs to be repurposed. The regional integration process can no longer really be an inward-looking one. It has to be an outward-looking one if the region is to converge. And I would echo Sir Hilary's comments this morning about the need for everybody in the region to become multilingual, but it can't simply be English or Spanish. It has to be Chinese and Portuguese as well. This is where the future of our world is going. It's a world which is going to be dominated by rising powers. China, Brazil, India, Russia, South Africa are the BRICS, but there are many others, Indonesia, Turkey, and that's where our focus absolutely has to be moving towards. It can't simply be looking to buttress old relationships that no longer, in truth, really serve the region very well anymore. That's all I have to say, so I'll happily pass on back to Mark. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Right, next, and this is really rather more formal than we had intended. We wanted a nice round-table discussion, but neither time nor the geography of the chairs nor the way the microphones are not clicking in is very friendly to that. So I'd like to ask Dr. Jacqueline Lagardia Martinez, also from Institute of International Relations, to come up and speak very quickly.
I'll try to.
And tell us what you think about what's been happening so far.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Please, can I have my presentation? Well, first, I would like to thank the invitation, especially given the fact that I'm realizing I'm the only woman in this panel. So I'm happy that there are other female colleagues here, so I'll try to do the best for all of us. Well, today I want to talk a little bit. I thought about a larger presentation, but I only have 5 minutes, so let's make the best of it, about how US and Cuba relations are impacting and can impact in the future in the Caribbean, especially in the CARICOM Caribbean. And, well, now I'm going to run. Basically, I'm going to make the point of what are the opportunities that this new dimension in US-Cuban relation is bringing to the region. And I would like to present this, please, this image. And this is a picture that I saw in a Jamaican newspaper, the Jamaican Observer. And this is giving us a little bit the idea of how it's seen this new development in the region. It means, interesting enough, we have seen a dual, perspective. First, there's a sector, I would say a broad sector in the Caribbean that has received very well, of course, these new dynamics in the region. We have read a lot of welcoming statements, a lot of interesting and a lot of joyful statements from many political leaders, organizations, institutions in the region. But at the same time, there's also this trend that is portraying Cuba as a new threat, as Dr. Romero already said. And I would like to think more in terms of what challenge and opportunities could be instead of threats. How are these challenges summarized? How can we summarize that? First, what Cuba represents in terms of attracting American tourists, American investment, and what is Cuba's possibility as a provider of goods and services in the American market, and how can that impact the Caribbean? And, well, I believe that the main point, the first point I would like to do here is the fact that it is important for us to understand exactly what happened on December the 17th. On December the 17th, the most important announcement was the agreement of renewed diplomatic relations. It means that diplomatic relations are not still fully established, and definitely that the normalization of the relations is something that is not already happened, it's not fully accomplished yet. Also important to understand is what did not happen that day. And first of all, the blockade embargo is still in place. So it means that the real possibilities for Cuba and the US to have a full normal economic relation is not happening yet. And also, it has also to do with American tourism. I mean, there's a big possibility for Cuba to be an interesting destiny for American tourists, but again, it's not happening yet. So I believe this is important because not only the Caribbean, but other countries have still a window opportunity in terms of locating and in terms of going to the Cuban market before that full normal economic relation with the US happen. And this is basically what we have seen in the last day. I don't know if you follow the news regarding Cuba on the newspapers, but there's a lot amount of bilateral meetings, a lot of delegations of different states, regional organizations that are going to Cuba today with a renewed interest of being there before this full normalized relation with the US still work. Especially, we need to know what this normal relation could be, but this is something also to discuss in the future. Well, some small tips, I'm not going here, just for you to see in these first steps that US companies are taking in Cuba, is that there are very specific sectors that US interests are looking at. Telecommunications, transportation, tourism, and also the health sector. This is important, this is interesting for pretty much everybody to see what the U.S. interest in Cuba could be and also try to take that into account in its own strategies to be present in Cuba. And here the most important point I would like to make, it has to do with opportunities for the Caribbean. How the Caribbean can make the best in this time opportunity, this is very a narrow window of time opportunity that we still have, I believe. First, in terms of tourism, it's been a long time that we've been talking here in the Caribbean about this multi-destination tourism. I believe it's time to really work into that and to have a clear strategy of how that could work, especially because more tourists, American tourists and tourists from any other part of the world in Cuba means more tourists in the whole region, and that could have a very positive effect for the whole region. The point is, how can we do all make the best of it? Also, I believe it's interesting to think in how this tourist activity can improve in terms of how diverse tourism in the Caribbean could be by taking Cuba as a multi-destination country and also to add Cuban's strengths in this tourist industry. The same, I believe that the Caribbean has a lot to show to Cuba in how to do quality tourism as well, especially related with how to deal with the American market. So I believe it is a win-win possibility here. Also, Cuba, as Professor Dr. Romero was telling before, we have this Mariel port facility, and I believe that could be a very interesting point for the region in order to have an access to the American market. Also, some opportunity to work there and to see how we can make the best of it. Definitely, Cuba is a market, a potential market of 11 million. It is time for the Caribbean to really think in Cuba as a place to sell products and to sell service, especially now that all this complex of measures that the U.S. usually follows regarding Cuba and foreign companies that trade with Cuba are supposed to relax in the future. So keep a track of that and see how can the Caribbean businessmen and Caribbean business community can have a real presence in the Cuban market. And also something that very interesting, we don't have time to go through that, has to do with Cuba offshore oil possibilities. And in that regard, I believe that Trinidad and Tobago can have a real interesting partner. I'm thinking in terms of CARICOM members for Cuba and having this